What is going on, Headliner Nation? Jake, Fantasy Headliners. Hopefully everybody's doing well out there today. We talk about quarterbacks here for Week 13 fantasy football. Who should we start and sit in the matchups here this week? Only a couple bye weeks with Tampa Bay and Carolina. So for the most part, you should have plenty of options available. The problem is some of these studs just aren't performing. Will they bounce back here in Week 13? That's what we're going to take a look at. However, before we get into this week's matchups, let's take a look back at Week 12 and see how we did. And it wasn't a horrible week by any means. Out of the 26 quarterbacks we gave a start or sit designation to, 18 of them were correct for an accuracy percentage of 69%. The biggest miss, though, on the week is obvious, right? It's Derek Carr, Las Vegas Raiders. Not all Derek Carr's fault. His offensive line played horrible. His receiving weapons played horrible. It was just a bad game overall for the Las Vegas Raiders, and Derek Carr absolutely sunk some fantasy teams, and I hate to see that. The biggest hits, though, Kirk Cousins, right? He continues to produce. Ryan Tannehill staying rock steady like usual. And Phillip Rivers has found the fountain of youth and all of a sudden turned back into a fantasy viable quarterback once again. But will they do it again here in Week 13? Let's go ahead and kick it off this week. No Thursday night game, so we're going right to Sunday. And the first matchup between the Cleveland Browns and Tennessee Titans. And I've been saying it all year with Baker Mayfield, right? I mean, he's a game manager now. He's not going to be one of these guys on a consistent basis to go out and throw for over 300 yards and 3 touchdowns every single week. It's just not the style of offense they're ever going to run in Cleveland if they have the opportunity to really continue to run the football a lot. Right now, I see a lot of people come back, oh, Baker sucks. Baker Mayfield sucks. If you think he sucks, it's because you're overvaluing him. He's just not one of those guys that's going to put up those huge numbers. And if you can come to accept that, you'll realize that for the Browns, he fits just fine with the scheme that they're actually running right now, right? If they're running as much as they do, it takes all the pressure off of Baker Mayfield. He doesn't have to go out there and force the ball into difficult situations. And that's where he actually succeeds, because we know he's going to make some bad choices when he's under pressure. Now, prior to Week 12, he's had 3 straight weeks without a passing touchdown. And that's kind of speaks to the entire fact of where they don't really need him to do a whole lot, because this team is still 8-3, despite him not throwing for all those touchdowns in those 3 weeks. Now, he hasn't had 30 pass attempts in a game since Week 5. I mean, just more proof that they're going to continue to run. He's only averaging right around 14 fantasy points per game, and he's great for Cleveland, just not for fantasy. This week, going up against Tennessee, they allow 22 fantasy points per game, 5th most in the NFL. Baker Mayfield is going to be within my top 20 in my rankings this week, but he's not going to be inside the top 12. He's more of a mid to low end quarterback 2 with a safe floor and a low ceiling here once again. For Tannehill on the other side with the Tennessee Titans, it's really hard to sit him, right? I mean, he's quarterback 9 overall on the season. He's got back-to-back top 10 finishes now, and they were against Baltimore and Indianapolis. So you know the guy can go out there and put up numbers in difficult situations, but now he gets the Cleveland Browns, who are allowing over 20 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, right about what Ryan Tannehill is averaging on a weekly basis. No reason to sit him here this week. He's going right back into the start column. Raiders and Jets, and Derek Carr went from death stare in Week 11 to just plain death in Week 12 because he killed a lot of fantasy football teams by being abused by the Atlanta Falcons, but it wasn't all his fault. His offensive line play was horrendous. He had no time in the pocket to basically do anything, plus his pass-catching weapons didn't do him any favors either. So what do we do this week in a great matchup against the Jets, who allow 22 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, which is 4th most in the NFL? I mean, we know he can't be any worse than last week, right? Right. However, a lot of people, myself included, lost a little faith in Derek Carr after last week because we saw how low the floor can get. He hadn't really done that at all season long. He'd been a pretty solid start for a majority of the season. Now, just can't trust it. What if the offensive line says, you know what? F it again. We can't afford that for a second week. Even though it's a great matchup, he's going to be more of a high-end quarterback too, somewhere right around my quarterback 15 or so in my rankings. Just not somebody who I can say is a must-start here in normal 10 to 12-man leagues this week. What about Sam Darnold? It's good to see him back for the Jets, but Adam Gase is still there, and he still sucks. In press conferences, he doesn't even know who's calling the plays at this point. That's how bad things are in New York, and yet this dude still has a job. Now, Sam Darnold hasn't thrown a touchdown since Week 4, and he's only finished inside the top 27 quarterbacks in the NFL once all year. Even though the Raiders allow over 20 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, I'm not starting Sam Darnold this week. Jags and Vikings, and in Week 12, Mike Glennon outscored Kyler Murray, Josh Allen, Justin Herbert, and Russell Wilson. Does that not sound like the most 2020 thing you've heard in fantasy football so far this year? I mean, he came out and didn't play half bad last week, right? He threw for 235 yards, 2 touchdowns, no interceptions versus Cleveland. And he said he was just going to go out there and let it fly, right? He said he had nothing to lose. He was going to go out there. He's been a backup for a long time. He's just trying to get a job again. And you could tell he was playing a little bit more free. He was forcing the ball down the field, and the Jags offense looked actually improved. Does that mean that he's now fantasy startable? Not so much. I mean, I think we kind of saw his ceiling. The only X factor there is he didn't have DJ Chark last week, and if he does this week, that could kind of bump that ceiling up slightly, going up against Minnesota here, who allows right now 19 fantasy points per game, but he's going to be more of a mid to low end quarterback too. If you play in GPP tournaments on DraftKings or anything like that, this is a name that I may think about because Mike Glennon has potential ceiling in a game this week going up against the Vikings. The Vikings, who have been able to put some points on the board and could force Glennon to throw all 4 quarters, just not somebody who I want to trust inside my top 12 as a must start here this week. Speaking of the Vikings, though, and Kirk Cousins, I mean, he just continues to have the hot hand now. He's up to quarterback 12 overall on the season, has 3 straight finishes inside the top 12. He's thrown for at least 3 touchdowns, 4 out of his last 6 games played, and he's scored 20-plus fantasy points in 4 straight ball games. Now he gets a matchup with the Jacksonville Jaguars, who allow 22.6 fantasy points per game. We know Adam Thielen is back. Dalvin Cook slightly banged up again. Does this mean we see a whole lot of Justin Jefferson and a whole lot of Adam Thielen? I think we do. Kirk Cousins, he's going to be my Manscaped must-start of the week here this week. Don't forget, after this show is over, head over to manscaped.com. Get yourself some goodies for the holiday season. Use promo code HEADLINERS, all caps at checkout. Receive 20% off and free shipping. But yeah, Kirk Cousins, fire up the hot hand here once again in Week 13. Next matchup is going to be the Cincinnati Bengals, Miami Dolphins in a matchup that could have been Tua versus Burrow, and I would have definitely liked to see that matchup a lot more than the matchup of Brandon Allen versus Fitzmagic, even though I love Ryan Fitzmagic, don't get me wrong, but Brandon Allen didn't suck last week. We can say that for sure. He's just not fantasy startable, right? He's not somebody that we can trust at any given point, especially this late in the season, heading in to the fantasy playoffs. The guy is serviceable in the NFL, not in fantasy football. For Ryan Fitzmagic, though, I liked him last week when he said he was going to be the starter, and I kind of like him again this week. He finished top 10 overall last week. Cincinnati allows 19 fantasy points per game. And is the run game healthy in Miami? Does anybody even know? Because Myles Gaskin, Salvon Ahmed, Matt Breida, nobody can stay healthy in that backfield as of right now, and it's forcing Fitzmagic to throw the ball, and we know good things can happen when he does that. Now, he has had 20 fantasy points a game, 6 out of the 8 starts so far this season. I'm starting Fitzy this week here in Week 13. Colts and Texans, and what do we expect from Deshaun Watson going forward now with no Will Fuller, especially in a tough matchup against Indianapolis, number 3 in the NFL against opposing quarterbacks? But it's Deshaun Watson, right? He's put up huge numbers so far this year. He's had back-to-back number 1 overall finishes at the quarterback position. He's finished inside the top 10, 6 out of the last 7 weeks, and he's been known to produce with lesser weapons in the past at times. Plus, he's really protecting the football. No interceptions since week 5, and over that span has thrown for 16 touchdowns. Now, the running game has struggled to say the least in Houston. However, the rushing upside is still there on a weekly basis for Deshaun Watson, and it's not out of his repertoire to pull it down and scramble himself into the end zone inside the 10-yard line. It may be a little bit lower of a ceiling, but there's no way I'm sitting Deshaun Watson. He's going to remain a start. For Phillip Rivers, I got to find out the location of this fountain of youth because, man, it's just catching up with me quick here. And now he's had back-to-back top 10 finishes himself. He's averaging close to 300 yards a game over his last 3 games played. He's had 6 touchdowns to only 2 interceptions over his last 3 games played. Plus, now in Houston, even though they lost Will Fuller, they also lost Bradley Roby, arguably their best starting cornerback, which only is going to help things for Phillip Rivers. My only concern here is the running game of the Indianapolis Colts. If Jonathan Taylor comes back in a matchup against the Houston Texans, which is one of the worst rush defenses in the NFL, do they really just rely on the running game a lot with Jonathan Taylor and Jordan Wilkins and Nyheim Hines? That is entirely possible. Philip Rivers is going to be a high-end quarterback 2 for me this week. I don't hate him whatsoever, and I would actually consider starting him. Maybe if you had a Tom Brady, you need a bye week fill-in, something like that, I would start Philip Rivers here in week 13 in a great matchup. Hopefully he can go out there and continue the hot hand that he's had here over the past couple weeks. Lions and Bears in Week 12, we saw the return of Mitch Magic. That's right, Mitch Trubisky back in Chicago, and it was ugly at times, right? Kind of what we've come to expect from Mitch Trubisky. However, the offense in Chicago showed life, right? David Montgomery had a great game. Allen Robinson was back on top of his game with Mitch Trubisky under center. He threw for 242 yards, 3 touchdowns, did have 2 ugly interceptions though, but we know he still loves himself some Allen Robinson just like he did last year. Now, the Detroit Lions average right around 20 fantasy points per game allowed to opposing quarterbacks, which is 7th most in the NFL. Do I want to start Mitch Trubisky in Week 13 of fantasy football? I don't. I really don't. However, he's another one of these intriguing guys that maybe you play some DraftKings, you're looking for some GPP options. Mitch Trubisky is never going to be a name that's going to be sexy to put in the lineup. However, I don't hate it this week, right? He's got the opportunity to go out there and put up some big numbers here once again in a great matchup. As far as 10 or 12 team leagues go, more than likely I'm going to have him listed as a sit. But anything larger, 2 quarterback leagues, I have no issues with Mitch Trubisky here this week. As for Stafford, not ideal, right? I mean, he's been super inconsistent here over the second half of the season regardless, right? His hand's still not 100% healthy. Kenny Golladay, still questionable. The return of DeAndre Swift, possibly, but we don't even know that for sure yet. A change in the coaching staff. A lot of question marks here this week for Matthew Stafford. And it's a matchup against the Chicago Bears, who allow only 16.5 fantasy points per game, 6th fewest in the NFL. I'm going to sit Matthew Stafford here this week until we kind of see where this offense moves going forward. New Orleans and Atlanta, and raise your hand if you miss Drew Brees. I know I do, but that's more for selfish Alvin Kamara reasons at this point, because Taysom Hill's been playing great fantasy football over the past couple weeks. In those last 2 starts he's had, he's finished inside the top 12 twice and has averaged right around 22 fantasy points per game. He just faced off against this same defense in Atlanta 2 weeks ago, finished as quarterback 4 overall, but Atlanta's defense didn't look half bad last week against Las Vegas, right? We've already talked about that, but is that more of a failure on the Las Vegas side of things? Or has interim head coach Raheem Morris really got this defense playing that much better? Because Atlanta still allows right around 24 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, and with the rushing upside of Taysom Hill, it is going to keep him in the start column here once again this week. For Matt Ryan, the biggest question mark here is Julio Jones. Does Julio Jones play? Because if he doesn't, Matt Ryan is just an average quarterback because his ceiling is basically gone. Now, he just faced off against this same defense also 2 weeks ago, finished as quarterback 26 overall. In that game, Julio played but got injured and only played in 22 snaps. So this one all depends on Julio Jones, right? We know they're going to struggle running the ball because New Orleans is number 1 against the run, and Todd Gurley's been inefficient anyway. If Julio Jones sits, so does Matt Ryan. If Julio Jones is 100% going into the weekend, all of a sudden I'll consider starting Matt Ryan more as a low-end quarterback 1, right around that 11-12 spot in my rankings. Not somebody who I'm overly excited to start, but he has a better ceiling with Julio Jones in the lineup. Giants and Seahawks, and no Daniel Jones for the New York Giants, it sounds like, which means Colt McCoy. Not interested in Colt McCoy. Not going to spend a whole lot of time on Colt McCoy. Why is that? It's Colt McCoy. I'm really not that interested, even though the matchup is not all that bad. It was tough to see Daniel Jones go down earlier last week. He was actually putting together a pretty solid game overall. But let's talk about Russell Wilson for a second, because it's good to see the interceptions finally start to tick back down again, right? Because that was a problem there for a few weeks. The problem is the interceptions went away, and so did the touchdowns. He's only thrown 3 passing touchdowns over his last 3 games combined. Now, yes, he's kind of suffered from a few costly drops at times from DK Metcalf and such, but it's just one of those things where this offense is still going to be reliant on the passing game and DK Metcalf. We saw them feature him last week, and now the return of Chris Carson, who we expect to be a little bit more involved this week, is also another weapon that he can use in that short screen game that's been so productive at the start of the season with Chris Carson. So obviously we're not going to sit Russell Wilson. He still has that safer floor. He's not going to go out there and kill your fantasy team. We just got to hope that he starts to go back to what he was early in the season for him and start getting a little bit more on the touchdown side of things. Look for some big plays this week to DK Metcalf. Maybe even a little bit more Tyler Lockett here this week going up against the New York Giants. Can't sit Russ, though, at this point of the season. Rams and Cardinals, and speaking of cooling off, what about Kyler Murray? I mean, you can tell his shoulder is not 100%, and why do I say that? His rushing totals are down over the past couple weeks, and it's got a lot of people really concerned, but maybe you're thinking, what do rushing totals have to do with his shoulder? Wouldn't he run more if he can't throw the ball effectively? Not so much in my opinion, because with your star quarterback, if he's nursing a bum shoulder, the last thing you want to do is give him the opportunity to get more hits on that shoulder by him scrambling and running the football, even though he avoids big contact a lot. He's great at it. You still don't want to take the chance at any added hits on that shoulder. They're keeping him in the pocket and forcing him to throw more, and it's hurting fantasy football-wise. He only has 10 total rush attempts over the last 2 games combined for 46 yards. That takes away that safe floor that we always talk about. Plus now, it's a difficult matchup going up against LA. They're number 2 in the NFL against opposing quarterbacks, allowing only 14.5 fantasy points per game. This is a must-win game for the Arizona Cardinals, though, in this divisional matchup. Don't panic just yet. He's still a quarterback 1, but we need that shoulder to get better so the rushing numbers come back for us. For Jared Goff, the inconsistencies just continue, right? Week 11, he was quarterback 3 overall against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Last week, quarterback 29 overall against the San Francisco 49ers. He's now thrown at least 2 interceptions in 3 out of his last 4 games. The Cardinals do allow right around 19 fantasy points per game, which isn't a bad matchup, but which Jared Goff are you going to get? He's a solid quarterback 2 in 2 quarterback leagues. He'll be inside my top 20, not inside my top 12, and in normal 10 to 12 man leagues, he's going to be a sit for me here this week. Pats and Chargers, and the return of Austin Eckler meant the worst game of the season for Justin Herbert. But if Justin Herbert's worst game is his floor right around 15, 16 fantasy points, okay, I'll take that still on a weekly basis. He's thrown for over 300 yards in 3 of his last 4 games. In that same span, he's got 9 touchdowns to only 2 interceptions. He's going up against New England, which is not an invincible defense by any means here in 2020. There's nothing that makes me want to sit Justin Herbert still. It was the first game back at Austin Eckler. He saw heavy volume in the passing game. Does that continue every single week? Maybe not to that level. And in this game, I can see Herbert going a little bit deeper down the field, which is going to raise that ceiling, raise that touchdown upside. He's going to remain a start. For Cam Newton, though, the guy just completed 9 passes last week. 9. That's all he completed. And they won. He only had 84 passing yards, 46 rushing yards, no touchdowns, and 2 interceptions, and the Patriots won. I mean, that's a heck of a floor, right? I mean, that's bad right there. That's not something you want to start on a weekly basis. Plus, the rushing upside is dwindling. I mean, they're using their running backs a lot more than Cam Newton here second half of the season. The touchdown upside has all but disappeared for the most part. He's currently quarterback 18 overall in fantasy football right now. It's a decent matchup, but not one that I can take a risk on here in week 13. I'm going to sit Cam Newton. Eagles and Packers, and Carson Wentz has to be one of the most frustrating fantasy football quarterbacks out there here in 2020. I mean, at times, that offense in Philadelphia just looks like hot garbage, right? Plus, you hear the rumors of, we're going to give more snaps to Jalen Hurts, and then it doesn't really happen. But if you look at Carson Wentz, he's had at least 2 touchdowns in 9 out of his 11 games played, plus has 5 rushing touchdowns. He's still quarterback 10 overall on the season, averaging right around 19 fantasy points per game. But in a matchup this week going up against the Green Bay Packers, it's a lot easier to run on Green Bay than it is to throw on Green Bay, especially with a healthy secondary of Alexander and King in Green Bay. So you have to ask yourself a question. It's week 13. Your team is probably in a time of need. Do you trust Carson Wentz and Doug Peterson in a matchup going to Green Bay against the Packers? I don't this week. I'm going to sit Carson Wentz here this week in a critical game for your fantasy playoffs. For Aaron Rodgers, though, I mean, you're for sure starting Aaron Rodgers, right? He now has at least 3 passing touchdowns in 6 straight ball games. He's finished inside the top 8 in 8 out of his last 9 games played. There's really no reason to sit Aaron Rodgers, especially at a home game in Green Bay. Yeah, firing up A-Rod here in week 13. Broncos and Chiefs, and hey, look at that. The Broncos going to have a quarterback this week. They should have Drew Lock back under center. Not that that makes me want to start him by any means. I mean, he's finished outside the top 20 in 6 out of the 8 games he's played this year. The other 2 games are great, but they're just so few and far between. It's really hard to trust, even though Kansas City allows right around 19 fantasy points per game. Just too inconsistent and not somebody who I want to put my faith into here in week 13. On the other side of the football, though, with Patrick Mahomes, I mean, this dude is heating up at the right time. He hasn't thrown for less than 348 yards in a game since week 7. He now has 30 touchdowns on the year to only 2 interceptions, and the connection between him and Tyreek Hill is starting to heat up here second half of the season. 100% no way on God's green earth do you ever sit Patrick Mahomes. Bills and Niners, and still not a lot of interest in starting Nick Mullins, right? I mean, the floor is still pretty low. He should have Brandon Ayuk back this week to go with Deebo Samuel and Raheem Mostert, but not somebody who I'm actively trying to start here in Week 13 by any means. For Josh Allen, though, he's coming off a slightly down week in Week 12, but he still had 19 fantasy points. Losing John Brown kind of hurts this offense a little bit, right? Kind of takes the top off the defense at times, does John Brown, but now maybe we see a little bit more Gabriel Davis in Buffalo, and that will keep the floor fairly safe for Josh Allen. We still know the rushing upside is going to be there. It's a tough matchup, though. San Francisco allows only 17 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, but that rushing upside, that bumps his floor right up to right on 19 to 20 fantasy points, which I'm fine with here in Week 13. Washington football team, Pittsburgh Steelers now, and Alex Smith continues just to be a game manager, right? But that's kind of what we expected when we saw him come into this offense. The ceiling was just never going to be that high. He only has 3 passing touchdowns in 4 starts, and now he gets the Pittsburgh Steelers, who are number 1 in the NFL, against opposing quarterbacks. Now, I can't start Alex Smith here this week, but I can start Big Ben Roethlisberger, and I'm going to stick with him here once again. There's just too many weapons in this offense, right? With Chase Claypool, Juju Smith-Schuster, Deontay Johnson, okay running game. Do we have James Conner back or not? I mean, there's question marks there. Benny Snell looked good at times, but they're going to throw the football, and his numbers could have been even better in Wednesday night's game had they actually not dropped a few costly passes there on the Steelers side of the ball. So Big Ben is going to remain a start for me almost on a weekly basis as long as his weapons stay healthy, regardless of their matchups, because we know he's going to go out there and has the opportunity to throw the ball 50 times a week, which is what we're looking for when we're looking for fantasy points at the quarterback position. Last game of the week, Cowboys-Ravens. In Week 13 fantasy football, does starting Andy Dalton versus the Baltimore Ravens sound like a good idea? I mean, it doesn't sound like a good idea, but who's on defense for the Ravens this week? They were already depleted with all their COVID breakout issues from last week, and then they got pretty banged up Wednesday night against the Steelers. Still waiting to find out who will they have in the secondary this week for Baltimore. So it could be a little bit easier for Andy Dalton, but it's still not something where I want to go out there and risk it. The floor versus the ceiling is a huge gap for Andy Dalton. It's just not a safe floor. If we could go out there and say, hey, in a bad game, Andy Dalton's still going to get you 15 points, then maybe I feel a little bit better, but I can't say that because a bad game for Andy Dalton could be like 5 points and really sink your fantasy playoff chances. I prefer to sit Andy Dalton this week. For Baltimore, do we get Lamar back? Because he's eligible to return Monday, December 7th. So how convenient is it that they play on Tuesday, December 8th? Now, he's going up against the Dallas Cowboys. They allow right around 20 fantasy points per game, and we already know something different than Andy Dalton. We know we have a safe floor with Lamar Jackson, right? He's going to go out there, and he's going to be right around 17, 18 fantasy points at a minimum every single week, with the potential for a much larger ceiling if he can throw the ball with any consistency. So yeah, we're still going to start Lamar Jackson here in this ballgame. If for some reason he doesn't play, ain't no way in heck I'm touching RG3 or Trace McSorley in Week 13. All right, those are my starts and sits for the quarterback position here, Week 13 fantasy football. Just a reminder that we'll have rankings coming out later in the week. Plus, don't forget to check out the live show Saturday evening. That's when we'll have the most up-to-date information to help you make the best possible choices for your lineup decisions. We greatly appreciate the support out there. Hopefully, you guys have a great rest of your week, and we'll talk to you later.